Now on that issue specifically of virtue. So in our society, the people who usually want to talk about it the most tend to be on the conservative end of the spectrum or traditional end, because they're like, we need to have virtue back in our life, and virtue is kind of an old-fashioned sounding term. So you get people like William Bennett back in, I want to say the 90s, writing a book of virtues, and it's supposed to be, a bunch of stories that show like, here's what it's like to be thrifty or generous or stuff like that. But this stuff winds up being crap because it doesn't provide you with, like you said, a structure. If you're going to call something a virtue, and this was a problem back in Aristotle's time, and this is part of what Plato is struggling with a lot in his dialogues, right? Or having Socrates and his interlocutors struggle with. You got to have something more in mind than just it's a warm, fuzzy term that we like to hear. You've got to be able to say what actually makes a person virtuous, as opposed to merely seeming virtuous or doing a virtuous action but not really being virtuous. And they start kids off with this quite young. And it's not just cultural conservatives who do this now. There's also others as well. Like let's call it a more generalized sort of let's be nice to each other kind of thing, like in K through 12 classrooms, mostly like on the K through 5 side, well, they'll be like, okay, we've got our virtues board. Which kid demonstrated this virtue this week? Who's going to try to work on this virtue? But they don't tell them what the hell it actually means, right? And in part because a lot of these teachers aren't qualified to actually say anything about it, because they never bothered to study, and it wouldn't take them long, but they never bothered to study any sort of systematic approach to the virtues, whether it's Aristotelian or Stoic or Platonic or what have you. Even reading Benjamin Franklin, I mean, he talks about the virtues, right, in his autobiography, and he tells you what they are. And so this is a really big problem, because when you introduce all this virtue vocabulary and the concept of virtue, but you don't give anybody any structure, all you're really giving them are tropes that they can use rhetorically to like make themselves feel good or look good or criticize other people. But you're not giving them a developmental path. You're not saying, okay, you want to be temperate. Here's how you become temperate. Here's what temperate people look like. Here's the motivations that you need to have, So I think this is quite important. I'm actually thinking, by the way, down the line of doing a class that would be specifically about virtue ethics, and it would be a much longer class. So it would start with like some Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and Cicero and all that, and then it would look at like, okay, how do they parse these out? What do they mean by virtue? And then look at some of the later work in medieval and modern thinkers, and then look at the supposed 20th century revival of virtue ethics, which is kind of a parochial thing, right? It's only a revival in analytic philosophy because they'd forgotten about virtue, but plenty of other people were still talking about it during the 20th century. And you get some really cool contributions that are made by, Alice Ambrose and Alistair McIntyre, and up to the present, like people like Robert Audi, who's got a great piece on virtue ethics in business, where he like says, here's what a virtue looks like, here's how it applies. I'm generalizing here. This is what it would, apply to in business. And so I'm thinking about, putting together like a much longer class on that, because I think it's an important topic, figuring out how does virtue ethics actually work. You do see people out there embracing virtue ethics, but it's this very like top down, super general, it's virtue ethics is different than utilitarianism or deontology. And it's so abstract that you don't see how it would actually fit into people's lives or any sort of robust tradition. And it keeps on making the same mistakes, like saying, well, if a virtue is a middle state, can you have a middle state of a middle state? And obviously, if you read Aristotle, he says, no, it doesn't work that way. The middle state is the middle state. You can't have like too much moderation, you know, something like that. Oh yeah, Harold has the thing. Yeah, that's it. I actually use that in my business ethics classes, and I'm thinking about incorporating it, believe it or not, into my regular ethics classes, because his presentation of what a virtue should include is so good. Another one I'm actually thinking about incorporating is Alistair McIntyre's essay from, I think, 1991 called How to Seem Virtuous Without Being So. And it addresses the issue of like, well, how do we understand virtues in today's society, And think about it. So somebody could grab the Nicomachean ethics and they like read it through in a kind of sloppy way. And they're like, oh man, yeah, I like courage. And they don't really pay attention to the things that he says about courage. And they're like, courage is just me, stuffing down my fear and running into the burning building. And then they encourage people to act like that. They show them some TV clips of, I don't know, firefighters or people like that. And they're like, this is what courage is. You need to be like this, kids. That would actually be damaging more than helpful, I think,